Welcome to episode 266, The Body Before the Behavior, How the Vestibular System Shapes Emotion and Self-Regulation, featuring Robin Abbott, licensed occupational therapist. Make sure to subscribe to be alerted about future episodes by Clearly Clinical. Learn, grow, shine.
Hi, clinicians. My name is Robin Abbott, and I'm an occupational therapist. I've been on a couple of these Clearly Clinical podcasts before, and usually I'm chatting with Beth, and she's asking me questions, and I'm answering them. And a lot of times she'll reflect that, hey, your view as an occupational therapist provides a new insight that as a clinician I didn't know. And I thought, well, while she's gone, maybe I'll just record some more OT cool things that you as clinicians in other practice areas might not know, but they might give a little bit more insight into the behaviors of your clients. That in particular would be children, because that's where I spent the last 15 years of my career. And I've written a book called Sound Advice, How to Help Your Child with Sensory Processing Disorder, Autism, and ADHD from the Inside Out. And it's about auditory and vestibular therapy for children, but it's also about how we develop as human beings from an auditory and vestibular perspective. So today I'd like to share some of the insights about the vestibular system and how that might be affecting your clients and their behaviors. I'd like to start with a quote from the grandmama of sensory integration therapy, which is something of an occupational therapist stronghold, Jean Ayres. She developed sensory integration therapy in the 1970s, and she says, "When something goes wrong in the neural functions that relate us to gravity, most people attribute the resulting problem to some other cause." And that was groundbreaking for its day. Sensory integration theory had an emphasis on the vestibular system, and by bringing attention to this unexplored sensory system, it let therapists, educators, and parents consider a new sensory input beyond just the five senses that we're taught in school. Vestibular inputs affect a child's ability to learn, to remain calm, to participate safely in social situations, and a whole bunch of other daily activities. But because we spend a lot of time thinking about how children learn by the inputs that we're giving them, we don't consider the inputs that are coming from inside their own body, or perhaps may not be coming from inside their own body, that they might be needing in order to make sense of the world. We don't think much about the vestibular system because when it's operating as it should, as it is for most adults, we're not supposed to notice it. It's like the operating system of a computer. It's in the background controlling and directing our keystrokes and our mouse clicks, but we're just doing the interface with the keyboard and the mouse and the computer screen. The vestibular system for us is incorporating all of the sensory input that we get into a cohesive picture based on where we are in space and how we want to interact with the world around us. However, there are times when, even for neurotypical people, we get a sense of what it might be like if our vestibular system wasn't functional. Moments like these pop up in daily life when you get an ear infection or experience vertigo or unfortunately maybe contract Meniere's disease, and you have a dizziness that definitely gets your attention and interrupts your daily activities. Even the sensation of being drunk, which affects your vestibular system, throws you off, and you know that something is wrong because you've experienced what it's like to have a fully functional vestibular system. So if you're a child who hasn't had an opportunity to establish what a functional vestibular system might feel like, you might not notice that things are off because you don't know how other people are feeling. But for those of us adults, we know when things don't feel right. And it gives us a glimpse into how difficult it might be for children who don't have a functional vestibular system or aren't getting enough input from their vestibular system to make sense of their world. So what is the vestibular system? Well, you might know that your vestibule is inside your inner ear. You have one on each side, and it's partnered up with your cochlea, which is the organ that allows you to interpret sound waves as electrical impulses. Your vestibule essentially does the same thing. The cochlea senses movement of the air, sound waves, as electrical impulses, while your vestibule interprets movement of your body through space as electrical impulses and transmits them to your brain so that that input can be incorporated into a broader scheme of where you are in space. The vestibular system is composed of the saccule, the utricle, and the semicircular canals. The utricle and the saccule are designed to sense movement or stillness in the vertical and horizontal planes. So when you're walking, when you're going up and down on an elevator. The semicircular canals are designed to sense rotary motion, such as when you turn your head or tilt it up or down. If you were to stand up and spin around until you became dizzy, the dizziness is not really from the act of spinning. The dizziness comes from the fluid in your semicircular canals continuing to move once you have come to a stop. So it's still sending your brain the impulse that, hey, we're spinning, but your visual world has come to a stop, and it's that mismatch between what you feel and what you sense and what you see that create that dizzy feeling. Now, when your semicircular canals can sense that movement that you've done over and over, it can also sense tiny movements of your head, little 1/4 head turns, or when your whole body turns around to face in the other direction. And your vestibular system has to communicate very carefully with your eyes so that when you turn your head left or right, or where you look up or down, your eyes can adjust to stay focused on a specific object or to search the environment to find something that you're looking for. So there's a very close connection between the extraocular muscles, the muscles that control your eyeball within your head, and your vestibular system. A great example of this is the vestibular ocular reflex, which allows you to keep your gaze stable so that your visual world doesn't bounce up and down while you walk, and your head actually does bounce up and down from your stepping motion. So there are two important concepts to keep in mind as we talk about the vestibular system. One, it is extremely sensitive. Just like with listening, the sensory organ that senses sound, your cochlea, interprets incredibly fine vibrations in the air, so fine that we can't feel them on our skin and we can't sense them with any other organ, but it is creating electrical impulses. Well, your vestibular system is much the same. It's picking up little movements of your head and your position in space that are so minuscule, it allows you to make teeny tiny adjustments to your spinal muscles, the muscles of your neck, the muscles of your head, so that you can maintain your balance. The second thing to keep in mind is that your vestibular system has so many connections diffusely throughout your brain. It plays a role in body position, motor coordination, spatial orientation, sleep, and eye muscle control. It's got to connect that input coming from your vestibule to all of those different brain centers. So one small piece of data from your vestibular system might go to multiple places within your brain to allow for coordination of movement in the body. If we want to consider the vestibular system from a developmental perspective, we have to remember that the vestibular system develops in the womb and is 100% functional, along with the auditory system, when a child is born, assuming the child is born after 24 weeks of gestation. In utero, suspended in the amniotic fluid, the baby feels acceleration and deceleration as mom moves around the environment, as well as the feeling of movement within the womb as the baby pushes against the walls of the uterus and moves his or her limbs. This is the baby's first opportunity to make a sensory match between what they feel externally and their own internal control over their position in space. Experiencing movement and gravity during the prenatal period allows a newborn to arrive in the outside world with already established expectations about how gravity and acceleration affect their bodies. An exceptionally cool study in 2008 studied pregnant rats who were experiencing gravity-free space flight, so space rats, which is pretty cool. But these rats were pregnant and they gave birth right after they came back to gravity-bound space, but they gave birth to vestibularly impaired pups. This led researchers to conclude that prenatal movement experiences shape prenatal organization and function within the mammalian vestibular system. So after the baby that we're considering is born, gravity becomes more of a force to be reckoned with and understood. Initially, of course, we swaddle babies. We want them to have some resistance because they can't control their limbs very well. But, we lay them down, they're laying in a horizontal position, and they have an opportunity to feel when those limbs are moving how much heavier they are, how much heavier they feel as they extend from the body. And then we carry a baby around and he or she isn't upright, and they get a chance to develop the neck muscles and their core muscles so that they can feel how much heavier their head feels as it lies out of midline or forward of midline, or when they're trying to lift their head off the surface that they're lying on. All of that information helps them develop what it feels like to move through space in partnership with the information that they're getting from their vestibular system. How far out of midline is my head when it feels like X amount of weight? So putting those little movements together with what their vestibular system is telling them is how the vestibular system becomes the fact checker for how they feel when they move through space, how their limbs feel when they move through space, and maybe how their vision changes as they move through space. And that all of that information has to coalesce into one picture that makes sense in order for a child to move through space and learn about how forces interact with one another. So this process of learning how to move against gravity and how to use the appropriate force continues in little increments of learning throughout childhood. And even as children become old enough to sit in a chair, balance on curbs and retaining walls, or coordinate their body for sports, these millions of learning moments are based on accurate, consistent feedback from the vestibular system. Now, if that's not happening, if their feedback from their vestibular system is impaired, the resulting data that they're getting isn't accurate. The neural pathways that they're supposed to form based on that information are either incorrect or not strengthened when they should be. So the child doesn't have an effective or successful interaction with the world around them as often as they should. The vestibular system provides what researchers Day and Fitzpatrick called in their 2005 summation a unique and complete description of head motion and orientation in 3 dimensions. I love that succinctness, but it's still kind of hard to understand. But the vestibular system provides information regarding self versus non-self movement. Are we moving or is the world moving around us? It provides information for spatial orientation. I am here not only within this space and I can move forward, backward, left, and right, but also I am here within this sequence of events. I know I have put toothpaste on my toothbrush and now it's time to brush my teeth and now it's time to spit. And because I know where I am in space, I can orient myself to a sequence of events. The vestibular system contributes heavily to spatial navigation. I know where I am and I know which direction I need to go in to get where I need to be. So that when I tell my child, hey, it's time to go to school, they can envision the process of going out the door and into the car, and the car moves through space and eventually they wind up at school, which is a very different environment from home. The vestibular system contributes heavily to voluntary movement. I'm conceiving of an idea that I want to execute. How do I organize myself in order to do that movement and achieve that goal? And of course, it also contributes heavily to ocular motor movement. So once a child is developmentally ready to start reading, they have to have that firm foundation of vestibular stability and movement in order to control their eye muscles so minutely as to move their eyes across a page. Not only is the vestibular system the fact checker for physical experiences that we are having, it also helps us predict what will happen in the physical world. Day and Fitzpatrick, quoted earlier, also said that the vestibular system, quote, provides our brains with a deep and special understanding of how the forces of gravity moves things, from the fall of our body as we lift our foot to take a step, to the fall of a ball during the game of cricket. I guess they were British researchers. In all of these situations, the brain predicts the trajectory of fall with startling accuracy. So, From what they said, we can assume that we understand how gravity affects objects because we first understand how gravity affects our own bodies. From the increased muscle action needed to control our head, balanced on top of our neck, to the feel of horizontal movement when we're being carried versus vertical movement as we are set down, to the coordination of our eyes and ears around our center as we rotate left and right. All of these sensations must match up accurately and consistently to build a database of vestibular sensory experiences that allow us to translate our experiences into guesses about how gravity affects other people and things. As our brains plan a motor action, they also make another set of plans about the results of that action. This second set of plans tells the brain what to expect in response to motor movement, and it connects the dots between physical force and subsequent reaction. This creates what is termed feed-forward, the ability to anticipate a movement and move accordingly. When a ball is thrown at you, you move to catch it by holding your hand where the ball is going to be, not where the ball first was when it entered your visual field. You anticipate a drop in the ball's height as it travels. You move your hand to where it's going to be so you can catch it. That is feed forward. Now in this example, it's easy to understand that a chain of events would break down if your vestibular system wasn't always providing you with accurate information about gravity, weight, and force. Your guess about the projected course of the ball would be difficult to create and possibly difficult to trust. If you think of this difficulty with feed forward in terms of behavior, children with difficulties like this can't guess what might happen when they take a certain action. For the ball example above, a child's reaction may be to cover their face in response to the ball chucked toward them, even if the ball wasn't traveling in the direction of their face. Some children will impulsively enact each idea they have to satisfy their curiosity about the result of their action. These children do seemingly irrational things, and they make us ask in frustration, "What were you thinking? What did you think was going to happen?" And the answer is usually, "I don't know," which means I didn't know what was going to happen. I had to try it to see what the outcome was. One of the most important functions of the vestibular system is to provide information about whether or not we are moving. If we know we are not moving, our brains label our location with a 0 point around which we orient ourselves. When we are moving, the vestibular system provides information which helps the brain calculate a new 0 point based on our speed, trajectory, and whether or not we are generating the movement ourselves or experiencing movement from some other force outside ourselves. Because the vestibulae sense the direction and nature of movement, they are a key component in forming our point of view, the location from which we perceive the world. Understanding this point of view and how it moves with us when we move is essential to developing an understanding of our visual world, allowing us to recognize objects from a different point of view, categorize them, because that's what the brain does, categorizes things, and learn how they function and fit together. Early development researchers Gopnik, Meltsov, and Kuhl artfully refer to this as the external world problem that every baby must solve in order to make sense of the world. I can't improve on their description of the essence of this problem, so I'm just going to quote it. Quote, "We don't even really see the things in a room. The brown, bounded shape that we think of as a table perpetually changes its form as we move around it. The apparently solid three-dimensional spoons and pepper mills are really just flat surface images on our eyes. The feel of the spoon in our hands is quite different from the shape that we see. The surface of the table is full of discontinuities, white holes where it's hidden by plates and bowls. We seem to know about a world of objects with properties that are quite independent of us, a world of tables and spoons and healthy soup, but all we experience directly is an endlessly changing chaotic flow of sensations. This is the external world problem." Now, it might be difficult to imagine not having this most basic understanding of the world from your own unique point of view, but you can guess that if you didn't, it would be debilitating. You might not be able to understand the world beyond simple sensations. You might only understand how things look or sound or feel, but have no idea of their purpose. or what they're designed to do. Items and actions would have no context or meaning in your world, and your world would be a disconnected chaos of feelings, sights, and sounds. Besides helping us to understand our unique perspective as a singular person in this world, the vestibular system helps us build a sense of our center of gravity. Children without an accurate vestibular sense have difficulty assigning a center of gravity to objects because they don't know where their own center of gravity is. They have trouble making motor plans that involve objects, so they always seem to be trying to come up with motor plans that really aren't possible. For example, in my clinic, when a child sees a row of 3 blocks stacked on top of a row of 4 blocks, I'll often see them try to replicate it by stacking 2 blocks together on top of 1, and not quite understanding why those 2 blocks won't stay up there on top of that singular block. Children who cannot easily assign a center of gravity, and therefore a very specific location in space, to themselves, will also have trouble assigning a different point in space as the location of a person who has a completely different point of view from their own. Children who lack this internal sense that they are located in space in one place, and another person is located in another space, may have a hard time with body boundaries and thinking of themselves as separate from objects or other people. Mom and dad are the same person as they are, so they already know. You know, the writer with autism, Naoki Higashida, provides a really interesting story that kind of brings this lack of perspective home. He says that he persisted in waving goodbye to people with his palm facing him, because that was his perspective when others waved goodbye to him, and he couldn't understand for a very long time their perspective in waving goodbye. I just think that really artfully illustrates how this can be a persistent problem, even if people have managed to figure out the rest of the world in a different way. One of the ways that I explain to parents who bring their children to my clinic about what the vestibular system might not be providing for their child is that the child may not feel grounded. We experience feeling grounded when we stand on our own 2 feet, when we're relaxed through our hips and shoulders, when we take a deep breath. We have that sense that we are in our body, and that's actually a tool that a lot of adults use to help themselves calm down, get oriented, stay focused, and participate in their lives. Because the vestibular system provides information about our 0 point, it's a primary factor in staying grounded within the body. So if your child is lacking a functional vestibular system, they may have trouble staying grounded. Now, children are inventive and smart, so if they are lacking that sense of groundedness, but they still want to accomplish a task or do what you're asking them to do or participate in life, they'll find workarounds. Children who aren't grounded in their bodies might visually lock onto something that's stationary because it gives them an orientation in space and helps them feel secure. This can sometimes keep them trapped in near space. They want to work with something that's right next to them and not moving because that's how they stay oriented. Other children might depend on the proprioceptors, the muscle sensors in their muscles and joints, to provide information about where they are and whether or not they're upright. This information varies with external factors like the nature of the surface that they're standing on, if they're carrying something, if they're exposed to a strong wind. So if any of those factors change, the proprioceptive feedback through their muscles can change. So it's not as reliable as their vestibular system. Sometimes these are the kids who always want to go barefoot, or when they outgrow a pair of shoes and they have to get a new pair of shoes, it is kind of a major trauma for them and their families. They need the proprioceptive feedback through their legs and their feet to be as similar every time they step as possible so that if something changes, they can react more quickly to it. I also find that children who depend on their proprioceptive system seem to stay oriented by staying in constant movement. The activity provides a lot of chances for them to be more coordinated while moving, but their high level of coordination gives the mistaken impression that everything is developing according to plan and that the body and brain are well connected. These children will likely have deficits in fine motor control, they might be hyper-emotional or rigid in their thinking, and they might have a very hard time maintaining stability when they're asked to be still. As an occupational therapist, one of the areas of the vestibulum, that little organ that senses movement in the inner ear, that I consider myself affecting is the saccule. The saccule is the part of the vestibulum that senses where straight down is. You have a little bed of receptors in the base of your vestibule, and it has these little calcium carbonate crystals resting on top of it, and those crystals pressing down into that bed of receptors is what tells you where straight down is. Now, the saccule is stimulated in an obvious way when you go up and down on a fast-moving elevator. Your eyes tell you the world is stationary inside that elevator, but you feel the movement as the elevator begins to move up. You kind of feel heavier in your body. That sensation helps us understand what the saccule feels like when we are using it to tell us about the world. Using the saccule to understand exactly where directly down is crucial because so many of our physical interactions with the world depend on an understanding of where straight down is. Knowing when our head or our limbs are off center from our very center of our body allows our brain to calculate the weight and create points of comparison for forces and physics required to interact with the physical world. The saccule is kind of like a carpenter's plumb line, shifting to keep track of what direction down is no matter what direction our head or our bodies are tilted or shifted in. And it gives us this information so that we can match up the muscles that are needed to contract to keep us upright and safe, as well as how our visual world might be turning or moving as our head turns and moves through space. Children don't have as much experience as adults in interacting with the physical world. They're constantly doing things for the first time in their lives. They need the vestibular system to be giving them consistent, accurate information so that they can learn to make all the necessary adjustments for how much force to use, which muscles need to move and in which direction to complete a task, from picking up a glass of water to giving a hug. This is why when even adults try something for the first time, it's going to be uncoordinated, and the more practice they get, the smoother their movements get because their vestibular system is telling them with great accuracy where down is so that they know how much force from that very center they need to use. If the saccule is not accurately sensing which direction is straight down, a child might have a hard time knowing the weight and center of gravity of objects, and therefore have a difficult time sensing how much force will be necessary to perform a task. If they don't know where their center of gravity is, they can't necessarily assign a center of gravity to an object. Neurotypical babies explore their own center of gravity as they begin to hold their head upright, and they learn to sit unsupported. Shortly after these milestones, they begin to play with the effect of gravity on objects around them. How many times will a baby throw a toy rattle off the edge of their high chair tray? As many times as it takes to learn how hard it needs to be pushed to get it over the edge and that the rattle will always go straight down. Again, Naoki Higashida, the writer with autism, explains that Earth's gravity doesn't always feel strongly enough for some people. He created a character in one of his stories called Autism Man, who prefers to live on his home planet where the gravity is greater, because Earth's gravity, he says, always makes him feel like he's swimming in space weightlessly. So you can imagine how that plays a role in possible vestibular dysfunction for him. Now, the plumb line of the saccule helps us create a body scheme. If we know directly where the middle of our body is, then we know moving forward within the body, moving backward within the body, or left and right within the body. For example, if our eyes need to shift to look left, we can only figure that out if we know where midline is. Knowing where our center is allows us to develop an internalized body map. Our fingers are further from our palm because they're further from that center of gravity. A great example of how we know our body scheme is represented in the oral motor control required for eating. Biting, chewing, and swallowing involve very fine motor movements that are developed strictly through a sense of touch and proprioception. We can't monitor what our mouths are doing with our eyes as we learn to take a bite and chew and manipulate food into a bolus so it can be swallowed, right? A child who isn't grounded in their body and doesn't have an accurate plumb line running right through the middle of their body may not know how to shift food forward and back within their mouths. They may not feel accurately enough the motions of chewing or the location of food within the mouth because they don't have that sense of whether or not things are moving forward, back, right, and left concretely enough. Manipulating food, tasting food, coordinating chewing, timing swallowing and breathing might require a level of attention that's difficult for a child with little sense of the internal scheme of their mouth and the rest of their body. Now, this lack of vestibular awareness might play a role in picky eating in a couple of ways. One is that the vestibular system has a very strong connection to the vagal nerve, which is connected to the esophagus, the voice box, and the digestive system. You might also know from your study of neurology that the vagal nerve influences the response to stressors and initiates our fight or flight response. If a child who doesn't understand what's happening in their mouth and isn't able to monitor it visually and is also having potentially their ability to breathe threaten, it can stimulate that fight or flight response. And that vagus nerve could kick in the reactions to the gastrointestinal tract, the esophagus, the voice box, and the diaphragm. So a child who's threatened by picky eating could very well develop hyperventilation or the need to vomit based on the threat level that food presents. So when I work with picky eaters and I know that they are having a gag response or vomiting in response to food, I do usually try to work with the vestibular system to see if that helps them develop a better sense of their mouth and makes it less threatening for them to try new things. You know, without this central plumb line, a child's internal world might be so disorganized that they're not able to tune into the sensations of their body. So this is the second thing that plumb line, that saccule awareness might give to a child who is dealing with picky eating. If a child doesn't have that internal sense that they are stationary, they are safe, and they know what's going on inside, they have to pay a lot of attention to outside stimuli, the feel of the seat underneath them, the texture of the clothes on their skin to help them stay oriented. If they're always tuned externally, they may not be familiar with sensations like hunger and satisfaction. So they can compound the problem of picky eating by not even sensing the hunger that might drive them to try a semi-unappealing food, or to realize they tried a food and it wasn't exactly what they expected, but that's okay because they still are in a comfortable place. If a child already has a heightened state of threat, they might be unable to accept a new food as non-threatening because they have trouble with the novelty of the sensation. I'll give you an example. The first time I ever tried a fizzy drink, a soda, I wasn't expecting such a strong sensation, and the fizz kind of bubbled up into my sinuses, and it was kind of uncomfortable. I think I remember my eyes watering. It was strong, and it was odd, but it wasn't bad. I was oriented enough to my body that know that these sensations were new and they were different, but they weren't threatening. I didn't gag, and I was so enticed by the sweetness of the soda, of course, that I was willing to try again, and I knew better what to expect. It could handle it better. I'm not a huge soda fan to this day, but I wasn't threatened by the experience and therefore was willing to try again. While we're on the subject of picky eating, I want to address a couple other behaviors that I see when I'm dealing with children who are often picky eaters that could possibly be related to vestibular function, even though the leap is a little harder to make. For those children who have a strong visceral reaction to watching somebody else eat a food that they can't stand, if you'll think back to when I talked about that separation of my individual perspective from someone else's individual perspective, that point of view that is established because of proper vestibular function, if there are vestibular issues with a child and they still don't have that solid sense of I'm me and you're you and the things that you're experiencing I am not experiencing, then watching somebody else do something that they wouldn't like can be very triggering. Now, an example that I can give from most people's perspective is, let's say you're squeamish about blood and gore, and you watch a video of a surgery. Well, a surgeon isn't going to have that reaction of like, ooh, gross, blood, guts. But some people will have that, I can't watch this, it's making me physically ill sensation. Only instead of being in association with a food they don't like, it's an association with blood and gore and guts. So it's a similar response, but for children who have an eating aversion, sometimes they transfer their point of view to another person and can't even really watch somebody else eat a food that they don't like. And finally, even though it's not an eating behavior, it is an oral motor behavior. I tend to see a lot of kids who stimulate the midline of their body, and for a lot of children that is chewing on non-food objects. This could be vestibularly related as well, because we talked about the vestibular system giving you that sense of center. Well, if that's missing and a child can kind of sense, you know what, I function better when I know where the middle of my body is, they might seek out ways to stimulate their midline. For some kids, it's constantly chewing on the collar of their shirt or a piece of their hair or their fingernails. For some other children, it's less oral, and a lot of them twirl the hair where their bangs are with their finger. They might be chronic nose pickers. If something comes at me from this side, this is the direction I need to move in. I think it just gives them a greater sense of that grounding, even though if they're orally stimulating, it's not necessarily an eating behavior. It is related to vestibular function. So at this point, I think I'd like to break down a few other behaviors that you may be encountering as a clinician and are stymied by, things that, you can address cognitively or you can address behaviorally, but you're not having the success that you wish you were. Maybe this will just be a different lens to look at these behaviors. Before I delve into individual behaviors, I want to illustrate that when the vestibular system is telling us that we're physically safe and secure, which is really its function, to tell us we're moving when we expect to be moving and that we're not moving when we expect to be stationary. And in that way, we feel stable and secure. The example I like to give people is, especially for adults who can't get their head around this, is, when you're pulling into a parking spot and you go to put your foot on the brake and come to a stop, but you don't realize that the car next to you is about to back out, and so they start backing out just as you're coming to a stop, and you have that momentary panic where you slam the brakes on even more because you're like, wait, we're still moving and we didn't expect to be moving. That momentary feeling of panic is what I think a lot of kids with poor vestibular function feel quite regularly. So they're always a little bit more hyped up, a little bit more on alert than they need to be. So keep that in mind as we continue to go through different behaviors. We might also be dealing with a child who's kind of already the hair trigger because they never feel safe and secure, and they might be searching for ways to make themselves feel safe and secure. So when the vestibular system is telling us we're physically safe and stable, it's giving our brains the opportunity to do something that's really imperative, and that's to ignore stuff. Generally, we think of our brains as paying attention or not paying attention, but really, attention is a filter, and it can get clogged with irrelevant information if stimuli aren't removed from the stream of data. Our brains remove unimportant information by ignoring it through a process called habituation. If a stimulus has caught our attention, for example, the feel of the chair underneath our bum when we sit down, then that's important information for us as we sit down. But as we remain sitting, we no longer need to pay attention to that input. We know we're sitting. Our attention is needed elsewhere. But if our vestibular system isn't giving us the feedback that we need to already feel dependably stable, it's safer for our brain to stay keyed in to that bum input to make sure we're stable. But now there's less attention available for something that we might be trying to learn. So that's a prime example of how the vestibular system can influence our attention, even though attention doesn't seem to be related to balance and movement, and therefore not to the vestibular system. But vestibular input helps the brain decide what sensations should be raised to conscious attention. The vestibular system is a lot like your other sensory systems in that when information comes in consistently and regularly, your brain goes through the process of habituation. It learns to ignore input that it no longer considers relevant. If some of you walk into a room and something smells, but after a few minutes you don't smell it, or you don't smell it as strongly, it's because your olfactory senses have habituated to that smell so that they can be alert to new smells in the environment. Well, the vestibular system works the same way. If we feel the chair under our bottom and the floor under our feet, and our center of gravity feels secure over our base of support, all of this matches up with the vestibular sensation that we're upright and unmoving. And then the feel of the chair and the other sensations like our clothes on our skin can be filtered out. But in a situation where there's a mismatch between what we're feeling in our body and what our vestibular system is telling us, more sensory information is let into the brain. That not only leaves less and less attention available for daily functions, learning, and building relationships, but it also creates a situation where children might be physically uncomfortable in situations that the rest of us feel fine about. A lot of times we will call this being tactily defensive. The child senses the seam on their sock, or the tag in their shirt, or that this sweater is itchy, or that those pants are too tight, even though those sensations from another person would be like, yes, these pants are a little snug, and eventually their brain would just block it out. These children continue to let that information in because they don't feel stable and secure at their very core, and therefore they have a hard time blocking those sensations so that they can pay attention to something else. This lack of habituation and ability to filter out and ignore sensations is really quite evident when it comes to the process of sleep, because sleep is when we have to filter out all the things and disconnect from our bodies and the rest of the world entirely in order to recuperate from the day. Sleep is a very complex neurological process, but really we have to literally, what we call it is fall asleep. So you can see that it does feel like a vestibular function even in how we speak of it colloquially. But when we're asleep, our body has to feel safe enough to stay in that suspended state of animation so that there's enough time for us to spend in deep sleep for cell recovery, to process emotions and thoughts of the day, and solidify learning. If our vestibular system contributes to the function of the gatekeeper of information while we're asleep, and it's not able to habituate to sensation, then you can understand how a child just rolling over in their sleep or shifting around may be hyper-alerting and bring them out of that suspended state into a state of awareness so that they can make sure that that movement that they felt in their sleep is a safe thing for them, that they're not falling out of bed and it's just them rolling over. They're not able to process that level of information at a lower brain center, so they have to wake all the way up to process that information. Not only might it be difficult for a child to stay asleep if they're vestibularly hypersensitive, it might be difficult for them to settle down enough to go to sleep. A lot of times children, particularly children who don't sense their vestibular sensation strongly enough and they use the proprioceptive systems to move through space, once they've unplugged from those proprioceptive inputs, by, say, laying down in a nice cushy bed, they feel a little lost in space. So it's their preference, without even being able to verbalize it, that they just constantly be on the move until they kind of hit a wall and pass out from exhaustion, because then they don't have to do that period of time where they lay down in a position that takes away the input that makes them feel the most comfortable. Clinically, when I'm trying to figure out or parse out if a child is having sleep problems because of possible vestibular difficulty, I'll ask the parent, what's the bedtime routine? And if a parent says, well, he just goes and goes until he passes out, and we try to keep him safe until he passes out, and then we can go to bed, I know that we're probably dealing with someone who is trying to compensate for their vestibular dysfunction by seeking out proprioceptive input through their arms and legs, and they have to get to the point where they're exhausted so that they can lay down and not experience so much of that discomfort of being still that makes them feel so disconnected. So that's one clue. Another clue is that if they fall asleep and they're asleep for about 3 hours, and we all go through sleep cycles of deep sleep and lighter sleep, if they come to one of those shallow sleep cycles and they wake all the way up, and when that happens, they have to go into their parents' room and snuggle up against them or grab their arm and throw it over their body. It's not as good enough for the parent to say, nope, go back to bed, or just lay down here on the floor and go to sleep. They have to be in physical contact with their parent. What that tells me is possibly they're borrowing their parent's vestibular system. I am exhausted. I need to go to sleep. I need some other safe physical feedback to tell me that I'm safe and not moving so that I can relax my brain enough to go to sleep. It may or may not be correct, but it's something to start with as I'm analyzing sleep. And a lot of times those kids respond really well to like weighted blankets or other ways for them to physically tell themselves that they're stationary and not moving. One of the things that I enjoy most about being an occupational therapist in this arena is that I can help explain to parents why their child has certain behaviors or has certain reactions. And in explaining that there are physiological processes going on, it takes some of the onus off the parent. They're no longer blaming themselves for what they might be doing wrong when they're just trying to parent their child the best way they know how. One of the most frustrating behaviors or emotions that I encounter for parents to handle when it comes to their child is dealing with anxious children, because a lot of times they're trying to figure out why their child is anxious and what they can do to calm that anxiety, because they know their child is uncomfortable, but no amount of logical decision making and discussing why there's no reason for anxiety seems to compute for their child. So I explained to parents that the vestibular and the auditory systems both have connections to the limbic system, which is the emotional center of the brain. And it's part of the vestibular and auditory complex's job to decide whether incoming information is a threat. If they're not getting accurate information from these systems, the vestibular system, the auditory system, then they can't develop a consistent database of what is safe and what is unsafe. And we've already discussed how the vestibular system gives us a sense of emotional calmness in giving us that sense of being grounded. But if that is also partnered up with an inability to predict what might happen with physical forces, then you can see where not only is the child not feeling safe and secure within their own body, but they don't understand how physical forces work around them, so they're not able to predict what might happen. In fact, I had a child who was about 7, and one of his behaviors that we really wanted to see improve and did improve was that he would regularly ask his mom to please not jump out the window while he's asleep at night. His ability to understand that the physics of her falling out of a window were completely dependent on where she was, not that she would accidentally fall out of a window without trying. But he didn't understand how physical forces interacted with one another. So why wouldn't his mom accidentally fall out the window when she wasn't even trying, wasn't anywhere near the window. He didn't understand. And so that contributed to his anxiety level. It's a really extreme example, but that's the kind of disconnect between logic and vestibular function for kids who aren't stable in their own bodies. I realize that mice and humans are different species, but we both have vestibular systems. And in a 2010 study of mice where they experienced a genetic manipulation of their vestibular system, those mice experienced more anxiety and stress during spatial-related tests, such as being hung by the tail or participating in mazes. The mice that weren't genetically altered in their vestibular system were basically challenged by those tasks, but didn't experience the anxiety exhibited by the mice who were vestibularly altered. The link between vestibular function and anxiety was also illustrated in a 2017 study involving mice. This study found that the severity of vestibular dysfunction affected a mouse's presentation as anxious if they had less severe vestibular dysfunction, or hyperactive if they had more severe vestibular dysfunction. In essence, mice with the same physiological dysfunction, vestibular problems, had different behaviors based on the severity of the dysfunction. And that's kind of been my experience with children. You have hyperactive children who really don't seem to use vestibular input at all. And then I have some anxious children in my practice where I'm like, okay, you understand movement to some degree, but you just don't understand it concretely enough to use it to help calm your anxiety. And that's when I really want to focus on giving them that central center of their body through stimulation of the saccule and see if that helps them relate to gravity in a more predictable manner. Another behavior that I just mentioned that is vestibularly related is hyperactivity. We've talked a little bit about it already, but I want to emphasize again that children who lack accurate vestibular input will sometimes use proprioception and sometimes use vision as the way that they anchor themselves to the world. Some children will toggle back and forth between these two methods depending on what's available to them. While someone who anchors using proprioception, they tend to present as hyperactive, they may be able to stay seated to complete a game or a task by switching to that visual method of locking on and anchoring themselves. But when left to their own devices, left to their own choice, they usually choose an active game where they're running around or moving. A lot of times when these children make up their own games in my clinic, the rules don't make sense, or they try something that is just physically impossible or dangerous. And the more we continue to move around in an unscheduled, unstructured way, the more they spin themselves up and get more and more hyperactive until sometimes they crash. They feel like they need a lot of physical input and they just kind of lose their orientation in space. Conversely, someone who anchors visually to help them make up for that lack of vestibular information is likely to choose a sit-down game or a task to play with me when we're in the clinic. Sometimes they'll place their hands on the floor for support, or they'll wrap their legs around the chair that they're sitting in to give them more stability. Given the opportunity, if I ask them to participate in a game where we're moving around, they'll rise to the occasion, but it will become uncoordinated, or they'll need additional time, or they may trip over things that another child wouldn't trip over. The last behavior I want to address that can be the most challenging for families is temper tantrums. Some families' lives are interrupted by tantrums that exceed the norm. All children have temper tantrums. They get tired, they get hungry, they're just human beings. But children with extreme tantrums have families that regularly have to change their plans or give up something to avoid a tantrum in their child. Those tantrums can be a result of vestibular differences. Sometimes, for some children, they can have what I call an epic tantrum. Seemingly interminable, very physical tantrums. These tantrums are very different from other children's tantrums in that they kind of stop the world for the family. Tantrums are defined by their rapid onset, their extreme physicality, aggressive behavior, and long duration. There's a couple of explanations that I can perceive as being potentially involved when it comes to tantrums and the vestibular system. Because children with vestibular challenges don't always understand things from a different perspective because they have a hard time with their own perspective, things have to be organized in the same way every time or be in the same shape or color or texture as what the child is envisioning in their head. And if the sequence or color or shape of the objects in an activity don't match what the child was expecting, what they had in the image in their mind, it kind of sets off potential danger signals, alarm bells in their head, and that can lead to a temper tantrum. Now remember that vestibularly challenged kids are already in a heightened state of alertness because their world isn't stable for them. So when something surprises them by being different than what they expected, sometimes it can put them over the edge into a tantrum. Sometimes once that tantrum has started, it actually feels good in their body because all of their muscles tense. They can push against something, especially if they're hitting something or just using their body in a very physical way. And so the tantrum exceeds possibly their need for it emotionally because it is helping them to feel their body, and they know they will feel better after they get all of this proprioceptive and physical input. You know, from a personal perspective, I like to bring up the example of my dad. It might be a little inappropriate in the clinic, but he really helped me figure out what's going on with children who have epic tantrums, because I used to watch my dad have epic tantrums all the time. So my dad is a pilot, and he's flown all of his life. And I realize now as a therapist that flying was his vestibular treatment. His vestibular stimulation and constant eye movement in the cockpit was how he made himself feel more functional outside the cockpit. He felt more grounded and adaptable to changes. So anytime he wasn't flying because he was grounded for medical reasons or because he was between jobs, he tended to move straight past upset into anger quite easily. And I asked him about this one day, and he shared with me the following example that I'm going to give of how his mind fails to adapt when things are not as he expects them to be. And it brings to mind that child who expects one thing and gets another, and even if the thing that they got was pretty close to what they were expecting, it still sets off a tantrum. This is what he told me. He said, you know, when I'm working under the car and I reach for a wrench beside me, I get irritated if it's not where I was expecting it to be. And if I have to reach a little further, I'm going to be a little bit more irritated. And if I have to reach a third time or look around for the wrench, I'm going to be mad. And I thought, that makes no sense. You're going to be mad at what? The wrench? But I believe the act of anchoring visually to what he's working on under the car and having to disengage from that anchor to search around for the wrench is just enough for his tenuous vestibular system to be thrown off that it initiates this emotional reaction of anger, even though all he has to do is look around for the wrench. It's disorienting to him, and he doesn't like that feeling of disorientation. And for him, it brings up feelings of frustration and anger. I could be very wrong about that, but it does help me understand what's going on in his head, perhaps. As a clinician working with caregivers for children with some of these challenges, it's less important that you're able to analyze what the behavior means internally for a child, but that you're able to communicate that there are physiological reasons for certain behaviors. Taking a step back and looking at behavior through a different lens, this physiological vestibular lens, can have a great impact on what can be done about a child's behavior, but it can also change the way the parent or caregiver relates to the child. Instead of asking, why is he doing this? Or how can I make him stop doing this? The better question might be, what is making it so difficult for him to adapt in this situation? And what does this behavior provide for him? And can we get that missing information to him some other way? When a child's behaviors are approached in this way, the caregiver and child become a partnership to help them figure out how the child can best adapt to new situations, learn about the world around them, and discover things and navigate their world curiously and calmly. As a clinician, affecting the vestibular system may not be something that's currently in your field of practice, but it's important to know that there are professionals out there who specialize in treating children with auditory and vestibular difficulties so that they can be neurologically rehabilitated. And those professionals are often occupational therapists, but sometimes they are physical therapists and speech therapists. And it's important to reach out within your community, get to know your fellow providers so that you can refer those children that you think might be struggling in this area to the correct resources. Thank you so much for joining me today. I want to thank Beth Arias and the team at Clearly Clinical for giving me the time to speak to you today. If what you heard sparked your curiosity and you'd like to learn more, my name is Robin Abbott and my book is called Sound Advice. I can also be reached at dovetail.robin@gmail.com if you have any questions. In the meantime, take care.
You've just finished listening to another exclusive Continuing Ed podcast by Clearly Clinical. If you like what you just heard and you need Continuing Ed credits, please visit us at clearlyclinical.com to check out our one-year membership, where you'll have access to our growing library of Continuing Ed podcast courses. Clearly Clinical, where our goal is to help you learn, grow, and shine.